Congratulations on your decision to start your real estate career, or at least to try to get your real estate license. And you can obviously have a really good career in real estate. And I don't think there's ever a bad time, certainly to get your real estate license, just because there's so many different things you can do with a real estate license. Um, Obviously, I'm not going to get into all that right now, but there's just know there's a lot of advantages to having a real estate license. Even if you never decide to help somebody buy a house or sell their house, or what we might consider to be traditional real estate services, plenty of other things you can do. But right now we're focused on just getting the license. And in South Carolina, it's a 60-hour Unit 1 course you have to take, which is what we're doing right now, or going to do. But once you finish this class or course, there's another 30-hour Unit 2, which is it's an advanced real estate class. And you'll have to take both of them to get your license. And we'll talk more about these education requirements as we go through this course. Just want to go ahead and throw that out there to you. So if you haven't already signed up or registered for the Unit 2, that's something you probably might want to go ahead and look at, because you're going to have that before you can get your license. Okay. So the first chapter we're going to be looking at here is dealing with just brokerage relationships. And really what we're dealing with throughout this chapter is understand there's a difference between the amount of representation you can give to certain buyers and or sellers, okay? And you've got to get that. Not only for test purposes do you need to understand this chapter, but this chapter will get you in a lot of trouble, or the information we're going to be going over here. It'll get you in a lot of trouble if you're not practicing according to the principles and laws that we're going to be discussing in this chapter. But again, we're dealing with what can you do? What kind of advice or suggestions, opinions can you give to someone looking to buy or sell a house? Well, that's going to vary depending on circumstances, and we're going to obviously go through all those things. So let's take a look at some of these relationships. First of all, we're going to cover some terminology, some terms involved with the brokerage relationships. And you'll notice at the beginning of every chapter, typically we go over terms, your vocabulary that you need to be familiar with. Some of it you probably have already heard, whether you have a real estate license or not. But some of it you may not have heard of, or certainly not be familiar with. So we're going to go ahead, go through some of the vocabulary that we need to be at least need to understand for this chapter. You'll also notice, if you've got your book, and you should have a book, and if for some reason you don't have a book, you might want to go ahead and pause the video right now. Contact the school, call the school, talk to Ashley, she's my office manager, and she can email you the book. Or you can go by and print it or pick it up if you want to. But you need that book, okay? All right. Well, you should see at the beginning of every chapter what we call an outline page. And on that page, a couple things that are kind of important for you. One, you get to see how many questions on the state exam you're going to get out of this chapter, okay, or out of each chapter, all right? And then, well, for example, in brokerage relationships, says you're going to get 10 questions on the national portion. Well, what do you mean national portion? Okay, well, when you go to take the exam, there's actually 2 tests you'll have to take. Okay, it's 2. One's what we call the national portion of the real estate exam, and then there's a state-specific portion of the real estate exam. Okay, and that will also apply for the end of course test that you're taking right now, this course. You're going to take 2 different tests. They have to be broken out for obvious reasons, I would think, but just in case it's not so obvious, there are certain things about real estate. It is what it is. It's not going to change no matter what state you live in. So all that information will be covered under what we call the national portion. But pretty much every state has different laws and requirements on what real estate agents can and cannot do within their state or jurisdiction. You'll hear that term a lot. So we have to break that out. The national portion of the state exam is the same for every state because it's all the same information. But obviously the state-specific portion is just state-specific. In this case, be South Carolina. So you're going to be tested on the South Carolina laws and requirements when practicing real estate. So anyway, you're going to get 10 questions out of this chapter on the national portion. Now, I will go ahead and tell you, and hopefully I'll remember to remind you again later, you're going to also get 10 questions out of this chapter on the state-specific portion. So both portions combined, that's 20 questions. So between the national portion and the state portion, by far, this is the chapter you're going to get the most questions out of, okay? Now, the good news is this is not difficult or complicated at all. So that's the good news when it comes to the brokerage relationships. So, but just remember, and I'm telling you, you're going to get questions on the state part because I'm not going to reteach this when we get into the state-specific parts. There's no need to reteach it. You should already know it. But you will get questions out of this chapter on both portions of the exam. Okay. The other thing you're going to notice that's kind of important to you on this outline page, we kind of lay out, this is where the questions on the exam are going to come from. They're going to ask you, obviously, about laws, definitions, and the nature of agency relationships, how they're created, how they have to be disclosed. And I'm not going to read through all this, but you can see it. But to me, this would be a very good study guide. So if you're reviewing or studying, if you go back and look at the outline page, is there anything listed on that outline page you don't feel comfortable with? And if so, then you need to go look in the chapter, find that information, and get familiar with it, because this is what they're going to be asking about. This is it right here. All right. So let's get started with these terms. The first term you see is agency. You're going to hear that an awful lot in real estate. Call them agency relationships. This is a relationship between two different parties, okay? One party being the agent and one party being the principal. The principal being either buyer or seller. But there has to be some kind of relationship between these two parties, okay? And the first one we're going to look at, the first type of relationship, is the agency relationship. Now, if you enter into agency relationship, and obviously we're going to get deeper into all this stuff as we go through the chapter, so don't get too concerned if you're not exactly sure what I'm talking about. Because right now we're just going over vocabulary. We're going to go into it, dive into it much deeper throughout the chapter. But agency is also considered a fiduciary relationship. So what is fiduciary? Well, obviously fiduciary could have a lot of different or several different meanings depending on how you're using it or and so forth. But here's what I think would make life a lot simpler, at least for what we're going to be discussing. Anytime you see or hear the word fiduciary, you need to start thinking legal. So when we talk about a fiduciary relationship, it's a legal relationship. There are obligations that each party owes to the other, and they're required by law. So these obligations, we'll talk about those later, what the obligations are, but these obligations are required by law. They're not it's not just a suggestion or an option. If you're the agent and you don't provide certain duties or obligations to the person you're working with under this relationship, you're going to lose your license and it's going to cost you some money as well. So we need to make sure we cover all that stuff, and obviously we will. So you see the term fiduciary again. But again, fiduciary, it's a legal relationship, but the person that's providing the fiduciary service, y'all would just call them a fiduciary, and that's someone that's appointed to act on behalf of another. So if I'm looking to buy a house and I hire you to help me buy it, you're acting as my fiduciary. You're acting in a legal capacity to represent me. Okay, so obviously you better do a good job representing me, because I can certainly cause you some problems if things don't work out very well. Okay, we're going to get into all that. And then you see the term principal. The principal could be either the buyer or the seller. But the principal is whoever you're working for or working with. Who's hired you or appointed you to represent them. Again, could be the buyer, could be the seller. Again, that's just the term principal. And then you see the term client. You hear a lot of times in many different types of businesses, you'll hear some people refer to others as their client, maybe sometimes as their customer or whatnot. Well, is there really much difference between a customer and a client? I will tell you, in real estate, there's a major difference. And this is what we're going to be dealing with this entire chapter. I'll just go ahead and lay that out in front of you right now. Everything we're going to be talking about is what you can do if the buyer or seller is a client versus a customer. And this is a choice that your principal, again, be buyer or seller, they'll have to make. Do they want to be a client or do they want to be a customer? Big difference. And this will determine what you can and cannot do for them. But assuming you're working with a client, that requires a contract, a written contract. Meaning, for example, if somebody's wanting to buy a house and they want you to help them and they want to be a client, then they're going to have to sign a contract hiring it's really not you. You'll see later it's the company that you're licensed with. But anyway, they're going to have to sign a written agreement hiring you to represent them. Okay? So to kind of make things very simple right now, if that buyer or seller that you're working with has signed a written agreement, not verbal, this is not going to work if they just say, yeah, I want to be a client. Once they sign a written contract, they're now a client. Okay? And with that client, that's what creates that fiduciary or agency relationship, where now there are legal obligations that both parties must provide. But up until they sign that written agreement, which is what we call an agency agreement, contract, they're considered a customer. Okay? So just keep that in mind for right now. So we've talked about agents, and I kind of alluded to this just a second ago, but we know when it comes to this agency or fiduciary relationship, it involves two parties, the agent and the principal. Again, we said the principal could be either the buyer or the seller, whichever one you're working with. But then who's the agent? This is where you also need to be very careful, and again, we're going to go through this throughout the chapter. But the agent is not going to be you. I know that kind of sounds contrary, but you're not going to be the agent. Every real estate company, certainly in South Carolina, and I'm sure most states as well, but in South Carolina, the law requires somebody in that company must be what we call the broker in charge. The broker in charge, the BIC. There can only be one broker in charge. Now, whoever that person is, it will say that on their real estate license. It will say broker in charge. And by the way, and you'll notice again, and it's going to be in a later chapter, but we're going to actually be discussing the different types of licenses that you could potentially have in South Carolina. Y'all, there are 5 different types of licenses, real estate licenses. There's 5 types of them. We'll talk about those different types in another chapter, but to avoid confusion, I need to cover this part, at least a little bit of it right now. You know, you hear agents and even non-agents refer to, use the term broker a lot. You know, I might ask you, well, who is your broker? And obviously, just by the intent of that question, I'm referring, who's your broker in charge? It's just, I didn't say broker in charge, I said, who's your broker? Technically, that's not good, because there's a difference between a broker and a broker in charge. That's 2 different licenses. That's 2 of the 5 options you have there. In fact, I could throw out a third one, is the salesperson, which is you're going to get, when you get your license from when you complete this training, you're going to have a salesperson's license. But there's a salesperson's license, there's a broker's license, and then there's the broker in charge license. Okay? So there could be any number of brokers and or salespersons within an office or company, but there can only be one broker in charge. And obviously the reference we're making there, that's the boss. You know, obviously if you're in charge, you're the boss. So now going back to this slide in the material, who is the agent? The agent is the broker in charge. Okay, it's not you. Now, it may be you one day, but it won't be for quite a while, I can tell you that. Because you got to spend some time as a salesperson before you can become a broker or a broker in charge. Again, that's all stuff we'll talk about later. So who are the parties? The agent, which again is the broker in charge. And I'll also tell you the broker in charge is also considered the company. So if I say I'm hiring such and such a company to represent me, then, well, who's the company? Well, whoever the broker in charge is. So the law does not differentiate between who the company is and who the broker in charge is. They're one and the same. So I could refer to them as the company, or I could refer to them as the broker in charge. They're one and the same. Okay. All right. But it also says we owe fiduciary duties, these obligations we referred to earlier, and we'll talk about those here in a little bit. The next term you should see is a subagent. Now, we already talked about who the agent is. We know that's the broker in charge. Well, who's the subagent? Well, the subagent is defined as an agent of the agent. That's going to be you. You're technically and legally considered a subagent of the agent. And maybe I should go ahead and explain this just in case. You know, when you get your real estate license, your salesperson's license, you cannot just go, they're not going to give you a license to go out there on your own and just see how you do. That's not going to work out well for anybody. So the law requires that you have to work under a broker in charge, at least for some period of time. We'll get into that later. Well, I'll just tell you, it's a minimum of 3 years. Okay. So you're going to have to be working under a broker in charge, under their authority and under their supervision. Okay. So whether you are a salesperson or a broker, even if you have a broker's license, you can't be out there on your own. So you either have to be the broker in charge, or you must be working for a broker in charge, regardless of whether it's a salesperson's license or a broker's license. Okay? Just to be clear. So a salesperson is considered a subagent to the agent. A broker is considered a subagent to the agent. Again, the agent is always the broker in charge. If you're not the broker in charge, then you are considered a sub-agent, regardless of which license you have. Okay, beat that up enough. Third parties. Basically, a third party is anybody involved in the real estate transaction, but you don't represent them. That could be any number of people. There can be a lot of different people involved in one way or another in this real estate transaction. Obviously, if I'm representing the buyer, for example, looking to buy a house, then the seller might be a third party to me. The seller's agent would be a third party to me because I'm not representing them. The attorney, the home inspector, the termite inspector, the lender. That list could go on and on and on. So there's a lot of different people at some point will be involved. I don't represent all those people. So if I don't represent them, they're considered a third party. And really another term that you're going to hear a lot is customer. A customer is someone I do not represent. Okay? There's no fiduciary relationship with that person. So they're considered a customer, or in this case, a third party. All right. Power of attorney. You're going to hear that a lot in real estate. And to be honest with you, I hear it being misused. We misuse some of this terminology a lot, which kind of contributes to some confusion for a lot of people. But, I hear, and you're going to hear this too, where occasionally you'll have maybe somebody say, well, I'm power of attorney for so-and-so. Look, I know what they're saying. I know what they mean, and I'm not going to try to correct them or do anything like that. But, power of attorney is a document. It's a piece of paper. That's all it is. So unless you can turn yourself into a piece of paper, you cannot be power of attorney. But power of attorney is a document that authorizes someone else to act in a legal nature on behalf of someone else. Okay? But again, what is power of attorney? It's just the paper that authorizes you to act on behalf of someone else. So what do you call the person that has power of attorney? Well, obviously, we would call them the attorney in fact. The attorney in fact is the person that has power of attorney. And the reason I'm trying to be clear, when it comes to the state exam, this is where they can try to trick you and mess you up a little bit, potentially. I'm not saying they will, not involving this, but I'm not saying they won't either. I don't put anything past them on the state exam, because they will try to trick you a little bit. If they ask you what is power of attorney and you say that's a person that can act for someone else, then that's not going to be the right answer. What is power of attorney? It's a document. It's the document that states you have the authority. The person that has possession of power of attorney is the attorney in fact. Okay, just to be clear there. And then common law. This is a very broad term, really, to be honest with you. But maybe I could just try to explain it easily this way, at least for now. But is it possible that you could be involved in a real estate transaction and somebody decided to sue you for some reason? Well, is it possible that they're suing you even though you broke no laws? There's no law you broke, but yet you're still getting sued. Is that possible? You betcha. You bet it is. Even though there may not be any specific law you broke, if they can show you didn't act in a prudent manner, or maybe you should have done something when you shouldn't, when you didn't, whatever. But at the end of the day, because of something you did or didn't do, it results in damage to somebody else. You might not have meant for that to happen, and even what you did or didn't do was not illegal. You could still get in trouble for that. Y'all, that's sort of where the common law comes on. Y'all, it says common law is based on customs. If you've been hired to represent someone buying or selling their house, there are certain things that, even though it might not specifically be spelled out in the law, there are certain things you are expected to do or not do. And if you violate those customs and it results in damage to somebody else, then you could have an issue there. Yeah, so I don't want to get any deeper than that on the common law, at least not for now. And then you see a term called transactional broker. I will tell you, this is still, as of 2023, this is still a little bit new to a lot of real estate agents in South Carolina, because we have not always been allowed to practice as transactional brokers. Y'all, this has not been legal for that long in South Carolina. But basically what they're saying is this. In South Carolina now, everybody, every licensee, salesperson, broker, brokerage chart, you name it, whatever license you've got, you are a transaction broker. It's not, so there's not an option or choice to be made here. Like, I hear a lot of agents today will say, well, I'm not a transaction broker and I will not act as a transactional broker. Well, that's not an accurate statement according to the law. Okay, the law says you are a transaction broker. So what does that mean? What is it? Well, a transaction broker is someone that has been approached by maybe a buyer or a seller, somebody that needs help with in a real estate transaction. But for whatever reason, they do not want you to represent them. In other words, they're saying, I'm not signing any contract. I don't need any representation. I'll represent myself, period. But there may be some things I just need your assistance with throughout the transaction. So we're not talking about representation. We're just talking about needing some assistance. Well, what kind of assistance are we talking about? Well, you'll notice it's on the slide, but it's also should be in your book too. This assistance is what we refer to as ministerial services or ministerial acts. Y'all, the law states I can only provide professional services to a client. You cannot provide any professional services to a customer. And again, they have to be one or the other. Well, and I said this earlier, how do you become a client? That requires a written contract to be signed by both parties. At that point, they become a client. Now you provide them with the full scope of all professional services you can provide. But up until they sign that contract, they're considered a customer. And by law, you cannot provide professional services. You cannot do that. So while they're a customer, you're considered a transaction broker. Okay? So as long as you're a transaction broker, that means you're working with, not for, you're working with a buyer or seller that just needs some ministerial services. Okay? Another term for ministerial might be administrative. But these are things that would not be considered professional in nature. Maybe it's a buyer and they were going to write up an offer to send to the seller. They might ask you, can you submit this offer on my behalf? Well, yeah, I can send it to them. But can I help them write up the offer? No. Can I explain things in the contract if there's something there they don't understand? No. Buyer, you said you wanted to represent yourself. Why are you asking me these questions? You tell me what you want, I'll do it. But don't ask me any questions. I cannot answer it. Y'all, you cannot, would your opinions on something, is your opinion considered a professional service? Just an opinion? Yes. That's a professional service. And if you get caught, and I'm telling you, you do this enough, you will get caught. You start providing professional services. Y'all, you're providing opinions, advice, suggestions to someone that is not a client. That's a no-no. That is illegal. You will go to jail. I say jail. They may not send you to jail, but you won't be practicing real estate no more, and you won't have quite as much money as you had before you started doing that either. So, you got to be careful here on how and when. In fact, if somebody comes up wanting to buy a house, wanting you to help them, but they don't want to become a client and sign a contract, I'd be very leery about this. Y'all, I'm just talking about, this is me. Now, legally, can you help them? Yes. But if you're helping them and they're not your client, what does that make you? A transaction broker. That's what we're talking about here. So you're not providing representation, and you better be very careful about what you do to help that customer. Okay? Y'all, we're going to get deep. We're going to talk a lot more about that here coming through. Again, I'm just trying to get some of this vocabulary out of the way, but at the same time, I want it to make a little bit of sense. But y'all, just to be clear, so you are a transaction broker. Y'all, you have to start somewhere, and you start at you are a transaction broker. Now, assuming the buyer or seller signs a contract hiring you to represent them, now they become a client. And now you're no longer a transaction broker. You're now acting as the agent, right? That's where the agency relationship comes into play. But up until the contract is signed, you're just a transaction broker with that buyer or seller. All right. And then y'all, some more information on the ministerial acts. We kind of already talked about that, but y'all make sure you know what ministerial acts are. I suspect they'll ask you about that on the state exam. But ministerial acts are just like administrative things in nature. Things that involve no level, no degree of representation. Basically, these are things you're doing that anybody could do, whether you have a license or not. You're really not practicing real estate. Again, if the buyer writes up an offer and says, can you get this to the seller? Well, anybody could email a document from one person to another, right? That's not a professional service. But you better not provide any professional service. These are just administrative type things that you're allowed to do. That's it. All right. Commission. Y'all, here's the good stuff. Y'all, how do we get paid? How do real estate agents get paid? Yep, I know that perks everybody's ears up. Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit. How much and how do I get paid? Well, typically, real estate agents are paid a commission, right? Now, so say someone wants to sell their house, they contact you, they sign what we call a listing agreement. Creates that agency relationship. You now become their agent, right? Or technically, you're the sub-agent, but as the sub-agent, you're working for the agent. Okay, so technically, you're representing the company or agent while you're providing these services to the seller, right? Now, when you go to list the house, something you and that seller need, well, part of what you're going to discuss is the commission. How much, seller, how much you going to pay me to sell your house? Y'all, there is no set amount. Y'all, it's all negotiable. That's between you and the seller. You will have to negotiate how much you're willing to accept to sell the house for them, and to provide that legal representation. Now, we'll tell you probably 95, if not 99% of the time, You're going to it'll be the commission's based on some percentage of the sales price. Okay, so if you agreed, for example, let's say the house sells for $200,000, and you agreed to a 10% commission. I'm not suggesting that's what you're going to charge or should charge. I'm just using this as an example. Well, what's 10% of $200,000? $20,000, right? So that means now the seller will have to pay you $20,000 to sell the house. So it's usually going to be based on some percentage of the sales price. Again, it does not have to be. You could just do a flat fee. You could just say, look, seller, you pay me $15,000, I'll sell your house, regardless of what it sells for. I'm just going to charge a set fee. And you can do that as well. But at the end of the day, both parties must agree, and that's part of the listing contract, that agreement. You will have to agree to that in the contract. So what do we do with this now? What about the buyer? How do they get paid? Actually, let me do this. Let me see if, well, I don't have that there. Okay. So here's how this is going to work. So let's just say, again, me and my seller have agreed to say 10%. I'm making up a number, and I will tell you that's probably not a very realistic number in most cases. It can be. And by the way, when you're trying to figure out, well, how much should I really charge? That, whatever company you hang your license with, your broker in charge will help you with that. Here's how much you should probably charge and stuff like that. But anyway, in this example, we're just going to say we agreed to 10%. Well, when you list that house, you're going to have to list it or put it on what we call the MLS, the multiple listing service. We call it the MLS for short, multiple listing service. That's an internet-based program, website, if you will. And every time an agent lists a house for sale, they put that house, pictures of it, all the information about the house, maybe it's just land, whatever it is, you put it on the MLS with all the information, photos and stuff like that. And the reason we do that is because, let's say you listed the house, but I've got a buyer looking for a house in maybe in the same area you've listed your house. Well, as the buyer's agent, that's where I'm going to search for properties if I'm representing the buyer. I'm going to go onto the MLS, type in or put in what my buyer wants, maybe the price range, the size of the house, the number of bedrooms, bathrooms. I'm sure y'all have seen all this kind of stuff on other sites. But I'm going to type all this criteria that my buyer said they're looking for into the MLS, and it's going to pull up a list of what houses are currently for sale that meet that criteria. And then we can pick and choose, or maybe go see all of them or whatever. But how does the buyer's agent get paid? Because, let's say my buyer decides they like the house that you have listed. Well, we know that you and your seller agreed to 10%. I say we know. You know. I won't know what you and your seller agreed to. Okay? That's between you and your seller. But you know that you and your seller agreed to 10%. Well, you, as the listing agent, will also have to pay the buyer's agent. I say have to. If you plan to sell the house, it's probably going to be pretty much required. But how much are you going to pay me if I sell that house for you? Because that's in effect what I'm doing. You listed the house for sale, but if I'm the one bringing the buyer, then I'm the one that sold it for you, right? It's only fair that you compensate me for that. Well, how much are you going to compensate me? Well, that means at least some portion of that 10% you and that seller agreed to is going to have to come to me. Now, as the listing agent, you're the one that gets to decide how much you're going to offer. So I'm not going to get into a lot of details with that right now. Unit 2 will probably be a better course for that. But really, what I want you to understand for this course and what we're really dealing with right now, when you negotiate your fee, commission with the seller, if you're the listing agent, keep in mind some portion of that you're going to have to offer to the buyer's agent. Now, it's not unusual that, say, half of it would go to the buyer's agent. So if you listed it with 10% commission, that means you might very well be offering 5% commission to the buyer's agent. And that means, so you keep 5 and the buyer's agent will get 5. Again, it doesn't have to be that way. You could say, well, no, I'm going to keep 7 and I'll offer the buyer's agent 3. And I will tell you, there could be some negatives when you start doing stuff like that. And I'm not going to get into that right now because that's just not important at this moment. But so 2 things I want you to understand. Commissions are negotiable, certainly between the listing agent and the seller. And then what the listing agent offers to the buyer's agent is up to the listing agent, okay? But I'm just going to tell you, if I'm that buyer's agent, and by the way, whatever you say you're going to offer the buyer, that has to be in the MLS. So when I pull that up, that listing up in the MLS, I should be able to see right there how much the listing agent's willing to pay me if my buyer buys the house. And if I don't like what you're paying me, we may not like that house, right? Now, I will tell you, that's a no-no. That should never happen for all kind of reasons. Again, we'll get into, that's some stuff we're going to talk about a little bit later on in the chapter as well. But I'm just telling you, if you don't think human nature plays a role in real estate, you're fooling yourself. I'm not saying I won't eventually show your house, okay? But I might decide to show them a house that's going to pay me more money first. I want to make sure they don't like this house first. And I'm not saying any of that's good. I'm just telling you, this is what goes through human minds, right? Everybody wants the most money, okay? So just keep that in mind when you're deciding on how this commission thing's going to work. Then what this last bullet is saying here, all the commissions, once it closes, is paid to the company. Okay, it's not paid to you, not from closing. It's paid to the company. So let's say that you negotiated 10%, but you also agreed to give the buyer's agent 5% and you would keep 5%. So 5% of $200,000, assuming it sold for $200,000, would be $10,000. Well, that $10,000, the attorney is going to write a check to your company, not to you, to the company. All right, well, you just made the company $10,000. How much of that will you get? Well, that's going to be, again, negotiable between you and your broker in charge. And that will be determined, when you are hired on or brought on as a sub-agent to the company or licensee, right? Every company's different on how they, and this is what we call our commission splits. How we're going to split the commission between the company and the licensee. How that works, it could be significantly different with every company. So this is just something you'll have to talk to different companies and see which one you like the best, is all I can tell you. But just for example, they might say, you might agree to say a 70-30 split, meaning of that $10,000 you just made the company's going to keep 30% of it and you'll get 70% of it. It could be an 80-20, 90-10, could be 50-50. Again, every company is different. But you and your company will have to agree on how much is the company going to keep versus how much they're going to pay back to their sub-agent or licensee. Okay. All right. So, y'all, that's kind of how the commissions work there a little bit. Some legal issues when it comes to commission you need to be familiar with. In fact, you're going to see this again, not only in this chapter, but another chapter as well when we get into some of the licensing laws. But you'll note that first bullet, it says you can never receive compensation from more than one party without the written consent from both parties. And that sounds a little confusing, but here's what they're talking about here. Occasionally what you will see is, if you're the buyer's agent, for example, and this is where this becomes an issue, this particular bullet is for the buyer's agent. In the MLS, you might see where, okay, well, if my buyer buys this house, it says they're going to pay me 3%, 4%, whatever it is. But then as you read through the listing, you'll notice occasionally it might say that if any buyer that buys or puts it under contract by the end of the month, we're going to pay a $2,000 bonus, to the buyer's agent. So whichever buyer's agent will bring the buyer by the end of the month will get the commission of whatever percent they agreed to, plus they're offering a $2,000 bonus. Again, not trying to get too deep into it at this point, but who's paying that, let's say 3%, 4% commission? That's coming from the listing agent. That's what they're offering the buyer's agent. Okay, well, who's paying the $2,000 bonus? If there's a bonus being offered, that's coming from the seller. The agent does not pay bonuses. They pay the commission, not a bonus. So if you see both a commission is being paid and a bonus, that means the bonus is coming from the seller. That's two different parties. And that's what this statement is talking about here. It says you cannot receive compensation from more than one party without the consent and knowledge of all parties. So in other words, before you can accept that bonus, you have to disclose that to the buyer. And when I say disclose, it better be in writing. If it's not in writing, then you did not disclose it, according to the law. But that buyer better have signed off on something acknowledging that if they buy this house, not only are you going to get paid a commission, you're getting a $2,000 bonus on top of it. And so the buyer has to acknowledge they know it and they're okay with it. And I'm telling you, most buyers, if they understand what's going on here, they're not going to go with that. As long as they acknowledge it and agree to it, again, all parties, then you can receive both the commission and the bonus. But if you don't have it in writing where you've disclosed it to the buyer and they've agreed to it, and you accept that bonus, that'll be the last one you'll ever take. Plus, you're going to lose it anyway by the time you get through paying all the fines and losing your license over it. So just be careful with that one. This second bullet says licensees can only receive compensation from their broker in charge. That's a biggie right there. That's the big, in fact, that's where a lot of agents also will get in trouble. We said just a few minutes ago, when the attorney that closes the transaction, who are they going to pay this commission to? Because the commission is paid out of the proceeds from the closing, right? If it was $10,000, who do they pay it to? They pay it to the company. Remember we said earlier, the company is the broker in charge. And then the broker in charge will write you a check for whatever amount you and the company have agreed to. You are never, under any circumstances, allowed to receive compensation from anybody other than your broker in charge. Y'all, assuming it has anything to do with a real estate transaction. Now, what is compensation? Obviously, that would include monies, but it doesn't have to be money. Y'all, could I have a buyer just very thrilled, very happy with all the work I did, and at some point after, say a week or two after closing, I get a card in the mail from my buyer, a thank you card. Thank you for all your help. We just loved you, help, yada, yada, yada. And they put a $50, $100 gift card of some sort in there. Is that okay? No. Y'all, that's considered compensation. Y'all, that was something they gave you as a result of that real estate transaction. So y'all, who gets that gift card? Y'all, that goes to the company. Now, if they want to get it back to you, they can, but there's a paperwork, there's an audit trail that has to be established here. Y'all, if you're ever caught receiving anything of value, that's considered compensation, and it didn't come from your broker in charge. Y'all, not only are you going to have some license law issues, the IRS is going to come talk to you. Y'all, there's some federal laws that you're getting in the way of here when you do stuff like that. And the IRS will have some issues with it, I can assure you. So just make sure you never receive any compensation, anything of value from anybody other than the broker in charge. Okay? I'd certainly remember that for test purposes. But you'd be wise to remember that for real life purposes. All right. And then the third bullet saying you have to have a real estate license to receive compensation. Remember, we said compensation is anything of value. It's not just money. If you receive anything of value as a result or having anything to do with a real estate transaction, the law states you better have an active real estate license to receive it. And I'm sure you probably know or have heard of some people that get paid like referral fees because they sent business to an agent. Then the agent pays them or gives them something to thank them for the referral. That's a no-no. If they're not licensed, you cannot pay an unlicensed person, and you certainly cannot receive anything if you're an unlicensed person for anything that deals with real estate. Y'all, that's a no-no. And I will tell you, the person that paid it and the person that received it is going to be punished under the law when they get caught. Okay? All right. Y'all, what you're looking at here, I'm throwing up these slides here. Y'all, you should see a term called single agency. Y'all, single agency. Y'all, what does single mean? One. So y'all, if you have a single agency, that means you have one client. You're representing one client. But you could also have what we call a seller agency, where the seller hires the agent, and the agent also has sub-agents that work with them. Could be the buyer, same thing. But y'all, if I'm only working for or representing the buyer, then that's what we call buyer agency. And that's also considered a single agency because I've only got the one client. Same thing if I'm just representing the seller. It's just one client. That's all they're really talking about here. All right. But is it possible that I could be representing both the buyer and the seller? Y'all, could I list the house for sale, which means I'm representing the seller, and find the buyer myself? Yeah. Yeah, it happens. In that case, now you're representing both the seller and the buyer. Now, that's what we call dual agency. Y'all, we're going to be talking about this a lot. Y'all, I will just tell y'all, dual agency is legal, but there's some things you better make sure it takes place before you get involved with it. We'll talk more about that a little bit later in the chapter. But But again, single agency just means I'm representing either the buyer or the seller. Dual agency means I'm representing both the buyer and the seller in the same transaction. Okay. And then you see what we call designated agency. I don't want this to get too confusing at this point because, again, we're going to be talking about this more detailed here in a little bit. But, is it possible? In fact, I'll just tell you, going back to the dual agency, is that legal? Yes. But I will tell you, the law does say it's only legal if both the buyer and the seller are okay with it. They have to agree to it in writing. Once you have a written agreement from both the buyer and the seller, you can represent both under dual agency. But is it possible that, say, the buyer, either party for that matter, but let's just say the buyer says, I don't like that. I don't want you representing me and the other party. I want my own agent. Well, an alternative to that, well, by the way, if either buyer or seller says they're not comfortable with dual agency, then that ain't going to happen. So that ain't going to happen. So then what happens? What do we do now if either party rejects the dual agency? Well, you got a couple of options here. One, you could say, all right, well, buyer, then you're going to have to go to another company and find somebody else to represent you because we can't do it. That would be one option. But another option is what we call this designated agency. Now, obviously, you'd have to explain this again to both parties, make sure they understand it. They have to agree to it in writing, and assuming they both agree to it, here's how that's going to work. You will now go back to your broker in charge, which we know your broker in charge is the agent, and let them know that you now have both the buyer and the seller, but one of them's not okay with dual agency, but they both did agree to designated agency. Then what the broker in charge will do, they will now designate another licensee or sub-agent to work with the buyer. Okay? So if you were the one that actually listed the house, then you're going to stay with the seller. So you'll actually be representing the seller, but there'll be a different licensee that was designated by the broker in charge to work with the buyer. Now, so again, both of the sub-agents, both you and the other sub-agent, are still in the same company. You both work under the same broker in charge. So by agreeing to designated agency, now both the seller and the buyer have their own agent or licensee, sub-agent, working or representing them. Working for them, representing them, okay? But you'll notice, if you're looking at the diagram, certainly on the slide, who does the agent represent? Both. So the agent, being the broker in charge, is still working or representing both the buyer and the seller. It's just the advantage here is that both buyer and seller have their own sub-agent that's acting and representing them separately, okay? So really, the main thing I want you to see here is this. Designated agency is still dual agency because the broker in charge is still representing both. It's just the only difference is each principal has their own sub-agent. So you don't have the same sub-agent trying to represent both sides. The agent represents both sides, but two different sub-agents, one working with one party and the other working with the other. Okay? So y'all, just real quick, a question that they could, I know they like to ask in some manner. They'll ask you something like, the buyer has decided they do not like or they're not willing to agree to dual agency. They want exclusive representation. exclusive meaning they only have just their agent. What might be an alternative to be able to meet the requirements of both the buyer and the seller? Well, the answer they're going to be looking for is designated agency, because with designate, even though it's still dual agency, or it's still considered a form of dual agency, it still offers exclusive representation. Y'all, again, because both the buyer and the seller now have their own sub-agent, and they're acting exclusively for each other, right? So, y'all, that could help you a little bit down the road.